Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to this appeals panel to hear an objection to a tree preservation order being made. Do we have any nominations for chairman, please?
I propose Councillor Dunning.
And is that seconded, please?
Seconder, Councillor Carpenter.
Okay. Councillor Dunning, thank you.
Thank you, Officer Rogers. Well, welcome to this appeals panel hearing. We're here to determine an objection to the making of a tree preservation order, or TPO, in respect of land adjacent to Chapel Lane, Langley. I'd like to welcome members of the panel, officers, and members of the public to today's hearing. I'm Councillor Barry Dunning, and I'm chairman of the hearing today. Welcome to the members of the public and the press who may be viewing the meeting live on YouTube. The broadcast will remain available for a minimum of 12 months. I would remind those in attendance to use your microphone when speaking and remember to switch off once you've finished speaking. Please switch any mobile devices to a silent setting for the duration of the meeting. For the benefit of those viewing the meeting online, I will now call the name of each panel member and the officers and ask them to introduce themselves. As I previously said, I am Councillor Barry Dunning, chairman of the panel. Councillor Fran Carpenter.
Hello, I'm Councillor Fran Carpenter.
Councillor Philip Dowd.
Hello, I'm Councillor Philip Dowd.
Good start, isn't it? Hello, I'm Councillor Philip Dowd.
Councillor Derek Tipp.
Good afternoon, I'm Councillor Derek Tipp.
And Councillor Neil Tungate.
Good morning, Councillor Neil Tungate, member for Bashley.
Richard Davis, legal advisor.
Ian Austin.
Ian's at the back there.
At the back. Great.
I'm Andy Rogers, Democratic Services.
And Hannah.
I'm Hannah Chalmers, Senior Tree Officer.
Fine. Declarations of interest. Firstly, I need to check to make sure that I, nor any of my colleagues sitting today, have any interest in this matter, which would preclude us from sitting to determine the application. Does anyone have a declaration of interest? Fine. I now need to check whether all the parties are present, and if not, whether they told the council that they are not attending. And I have been given a list as follows. So I have speakers. Do we have anyone who's notified that they're not coming? No. Okay. So please indicate if you are present and later repeat your name when you speak during the hearing. The following persons have indicated their intention to speak at the hearing. Mr. Ben Smith, objector to the TPO. Councillor Alexis McAvoy, New Forest District Council for Calshot area and County Councillor for South Waterside.
Yes, Chairman, thank you.
Mr. and Mrs. Burrows, local residents. And Councillor Alexa Carcass, is that how I say it?
Correct. Present.
Forley Parish Council.
Present, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I'm now going to read out the procedure for this hearing. I now wish to establish the order of events for this hearing. All parties have been sent the procedure for the hearing. In brief, the procedure is as follows. Firstly, I will ask the legal advisor if there are any issues that require clarification. I will then ask the objector, Mr. Smith, to explain the reasons for his objection. After this, I'll give the tree officer and then the panel the opportunity to ask any questions of the objector. I will then ask any supporters of the objector to put their case. The tree officer and the panel will have the opportunity to ask them questions. The tree officer will then be asked to put the case for the preservation order. The objector and then the panel may ask questions of the tree officer. Supporters of the order may be heard and they may ask questions of the objector and the tree officer. Members of the panel may ask questions of the supporters. I will then invite the local member, Councillor Mrs. McAvoy, to speak. The Parish Council representative, Alexis Carcass, will be invited to speak. The panel may ask questions of Councillors McAvoy and Carcass. The tree officer and then the objectors may sum up. I will then close the hearing. The panel will then discuss the matter on the basis of the evidence that has been presented to it. No additional information will be sought once the hearing has been closed, and the press and the public may remain whilst that decision is made. The decision of the panel will be given in writing to all parties as soon as possible after the hearing. Thank you. So, before I begin, I will ask the legal advisor if there are any issues that require clarification.
Thank you, Chairman. In my advice, I'll just refer to a couple of abbreviations. When I refer to a TPO, that is the Tree Preservation Order. And when I refer to the Act, that is the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. The test for the panel today is to apply when determining whether to make the TPO. It is twofold. The panel may confirm a TPO where it considers that it is expedient and in the interests of amenity to do so. Amenity is not defined in the Act, and it is for the panel to determine whether the tree has amenity value. The panel should have a reference to the guidance issued by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. A TPO should be used to protect trees and woodlands if their removal would have a significant negative impact on the local environment and its enjoyment by the public. There should be a reasonable degree of public benefit from the woodlands. The panel can take these into account for present or future benefit. The guidance suggests taking into account visibility. The trees should therefore usually be visible from a public place, save in exceptional circumstances. It is also advisable to take into account the impact of the trees. The panel should also consider the particular importance of the trees by reference to their characteristics, including size and form, future potential as an amenity, the rarity, cultural or historic value, the contribution to and relationship with the landscape, the contribution to the character or appearance of a conservation area. The panel might also take into account other factors such as importance to nature, conservation or response to climate change, but these factors alone would not warrant making an order. On the issue of expediency, if the panel determines that the tree or trees might merit protection on amenity ground, it then needs to consider whether it would be expedient to make the TPO. Expediency is not defined in the Act. The guidance from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government says it's unlikely to be necessary to make an order in respect of trees which are under good arboricultural management. It may be expedient to make an order if it is believed the trees are at risk of being felled, pruned or damaged in ways which would have significant impact on the amenity of the area, but the expediency test does not require that there is an immediate risk to the trees. The risk to trees as a result of development pressures may make it expedient to make an order, and orders can be made as a precaution. On the issue of human rights, the panel should take into account human rights of interested parties, in particular Article 1, the right to peaceful enjoyment of possessions. Interference may be justified in the public interest, though. Article 8, the right to respect for private and family home and life. Interference may be justified as being in accordance with the law necessary in a democratic society for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, as the objector, would you like to present your case, please?
Thanks very much. There's three things that I'd like to say, because the majority of my objections set out in this submission. The first is the plan is slightly inaccurate, and if the order is made on the plan, I think it doesn't protect some of the trees. So if I can give the legal advisor a copy of the plan as I've marked up, you can see the discrepancies. So there's two plans there. The first is the land registration plan and the second is the TPO plan. I've marked both of them up to make it easy for you. The sections shaded in red are the TPO map that hasn't covered all of the land, and the sections in blue are the TPO plan that goes outside the boundaries of the land.
Let me just check the red and blue, you refer to that one?
To both. I've used the same colouring for both plans.
Okay.
So why is that important? Is because under the TPO rules, you're not allowed to make a TPO unless you've served it on all of the landowners affected by the map. And at the moment, the map includes Forestry Commission land, so that should be removed. That's fine because the TPO order allows for minor amendments to be made for the plan. However, the red sections aren't included in the TPO, and there's at least 30 or 40 trees on the western boundary which aren't included in the TPO. So I think you've got to issue a third TPO to cover those ones.
That's these, sir?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Whilst you're looking at those, I want to say that I've got no problem with protecting the trees whatsoever. That's the reason that I bought the forest. That's the reason that I've cleared the rhododendron. My only issue is I want to be in charge of restocking the forest. And my way of thinking is that there's roughly 1 million acorns every single year that are going to be dropping in the forest. And logic dictates that we're going to end up with a forest that is 100% oak. I would like to diversify the forest and have as many different species as possible. Now, the TPO, the blanket TPO is not going to stop me doing that, but it's going to make it 1 million times harder. So all I'd say is probably the best thing to do is make a specific TPO on each of the oaks, and then that won't hinder me restocking the forest in line with the New Forest District Council's 2025 tree strategy. And the response to that from the council might be, well, we don't have the resources to map every single tree, but I've mapped them for you. And as part of your tree strategy, you intend to map every single tree anyway. So I was thinking, come to my forest, that's where you can start. You can map the trees and we can work in coordination. And then the third thing, I suppose, is I think the legal advisor should advise you on the liability for compensation under the TPO scheme. I think there's a facility whereby you can apply for compensation to the value of the timber, which is roughly £230 per cubic metre. So quick calculations comes out between £50,000 and £100,000. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to claim compensation, but your strategy has to take into consideration the compensation.
Thank you. That's it. Fine, thank you. Does the tree officer have any questions for the objector?
Yes, do I need to introduce myself again? So, Hannah Chalmers, Senior Tree Officer, New Forest District Council. I'm quite puzzled by the claim for compensation statement. If you're going to fell that amount of timber, I'd assume you'd be looking for a felling licence, because you'd be in breach, you'd be going over the 4 cubic metres per quarter for timber. And obviously, if you got granted a felling licence, that would override the tree preservation order anyway. So the argument that you'll be out of pocket for the value of the timber, I think is fairly moot, because you'd need to go through the felling licence process, which, as I said, would override the TPS already there. So if you could explain that, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
So under the Forestry Commission's felling licence programme, you need to apply for a licence if you're over a certain amount of tonnage, cubic metres. You don't have to apply for a licence if you're below that. So if the trees are under the licence requirements, you don't need a felling licence to apply for them. So you then apply to the council for permission to remove them. The council say no, and it's the council that then pay compensation as a result. So I'm not saying that you apply for a blanket felling licence over every single tree on day one, but every 3 months you could conceivably get paid £1,000 from the council.
Have you had your timber valued by a timber company and the quality of it in terms of if there's any knots or burrs and things like that? They like straight trees, no rot or decay. That proves that the value of the timber is as £100,000.
Yes, Soft Tree Tree Milling Company in Cadland gave a rough figure. I'm not saying that my figures are accurate. I'm just saying that the trees are big, and there's a lot of timber there, so there's going to be some compensation. That's all.
Any more questions?
No, that's my question. Thank you.
Fine, thank you. Do any members of the panel have questions for the Director? Anyone at all? Okay. Councillor Tripp.
Good morning, Mr. Smith. Well, afternoon now, isn't it? That's right. Now, you said that in your opinion, let me ask you the question. In your opinion, do you think you'd be able to get a felling licence to harvest the trees if they were subject to a TPO? Do you think that would prevent you from harvesting, or would you still be able to do it?
I think you can harvest some of the timber under a felling licence, but they wouldn't allow you to fell every single tree. They would have the same opinion of the council of some of the biggest trees right on the boundary, but there's 80 oak trees, so I'm sure they would grant a licence for quite a few of them.
Okay, thank you for that. So you're saying then that you would be able to get a licence, but you're saying all 80. I mean, what sort of numbers of trees would you be considering actually felling in a year, for example?
So I want to protect the trees. I have no interest in felling the oak trees. My point was that you're liable to compensation, and I think as part of that you should do an assessment of what the liability would be if the council decide to go for the TPO. At the moment the trees are protected by the Forestry Commission's itself, and they have a compensation scheme and a felling licence scheme. What you're effectively doing with the TPO is stepping into the shoes of the Forestry Commission and taking on the responsibility and the liability. So it's just a minor point.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councillor Carpenter.
In our report, Tree Officer's report, it actually says that the woodland order will prevent the site being opened up. You've said it will prevent the site being opened up to the public for recreation use. But why would a TPO prevent that, in your opinion?
Well, if the council can confirm that they've got absolutely no worries whatsoever about children running through the forest and trampling on the acorns and the small seedlings and then being damaged, and then me not becoming prosecuted, then that's absolutely fine. I will let the children in. My issue is if you come back in 20 years' time and you say, well, there should be an oak trees along this path that the children use regularly, and we think that you've intentionally removed all of these seedlings, now we're going to prosecute you. So being a solicitor, it's a strict liability offence. You have no defence to damaging a tree under a TPO, and there's no difference between an acorn, well, a seedling, and a fully grown 500-year-old tree. There is the public requirement, well, there is the benefit of making a prosecution, and the council might agree that there is no benefit in making a prosecution for damaged seedlings, but it still doesn't mean that you couldn't.
Thank you. Can I also ask the other question on here, which is what form the recreational use will be? It doesn't actually clearly say so.
We're trying to run a woodland school for some of the most vulnerable children. We've got children with Down syndrome, ADHD, people that have been excluded from mainstream schools, and they come down for a safe space.
So I was wondering, is that already happening? Are you already having children on the site for that?
We have them in a small area near the entrance.
Thank you. Is that Councillor Carpenter? That's it. Fine. Anyone else? Yes, please. Thank you.
Could you just elaborate on because my understanding is that you would rather have individual TPOs on certain trees, and I guess the crux of your argument is that the management plan that you have already, you feel, renders a wider TPO irrelevant because of the quality of the plan. Could you just elaborate a little bit more for us about what you see as the strength of your current management plan? Thank you.
Oh, that's very kind of you to ask that question. In my submission, I've given you a spreadsheet of all the different trees, all the different tree species and all the different birds, insects and mammals, just as an example. My fear is that if you have 99% oaks in a forest and then there's a disease, the whole forest is eradicated. I want to hedge our bets, diversify, which is actually the recommendation of the NFDC in their tree strategy as well. The strength of that is that you're resilient for the next 200 years. And I'm not saying that I can't still do it. I would just rather the support from the council in doing that, rather than the blanket TPO, which would make it harder. The restocking of the trees, we're talking thousands, and I have to protect them for 20, 30 years. So I just want to make it as easy for myself to make it as good as possible in the future. And yeah, if the council make the TPO, the woodland management plan, when it's enacted with the Forestry Commission, will still allow me to do this. But at the moment, the Forestry Commission management plan isn't in effect. So you have to make the decision today on the current state of affairs.
Thank you, Councillor Tripp.
Yep, thank you. A couple more questions, if I may, please. Do you have, or have you ever had, any plans to fell the trees and create a Christmas tree plantation, as has been alleged on page 25 of our documents?
So I had imagined that children from Chapel Lane and their parents could wander into the forest a week before Christmas and fell their own Christmas tree, and then the dads could carry them home on their shoulders and they could put them up. I wasn't going to take out any oak trees to plant some fir trees. I was going to pop in maybe, I don't know, 100 equally spaced, somewhere where it's not going to hurt anyone, and then just give the families a bit of enjoyment. Yeah, there was never going to be any oak trees or any trees whatsoever taken out to plant Christmas trees.
Thank you. And finally, sorry, and finally, would having a tree preservation order prevent you from applying for a countryside stewardship grant, which I know you are considering?
No, not at all.
Councillor Carpenter, I believe you had another.
Sorry to come back. Yeah, but I was just thinking about our visit this morning. You know, the site at the moment when I walk by, and it's the first time I've seen it, it was, you know, it's a bit of a mess. It looked a bit of a mess with all the rough barriers of dead material along the edges. You know, have you got plans, if you were able to object, and your objection was successful today, would you be tidying it up? I just obviously think that it doesn't look like it should from the forest. It's really changed the landscape from the forest, in my opinion. You know, what are you going to do to rectify that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I haven't used tractors or huge teams of gangs. I've done it basically all by hand. You need a license to take the Rhododendron ponticum off-site, or the other option is to burn it. So what I've done with 90% of it is to pile it in a dead hedge alongside. Now the intention is to chip, which is basically to make it into mulch. But that costs an awful lot of money, and that is my intention to do that. And it does look a mess because there's loads of mud everywhere. But apparently the bacteria in the soil can last for 2 years after the rhododendron has been removed, sometimes more. So there hasn't been as much regeneration as I'd have liked. Virtually none in places.
Thank you. Councillor Tongate.
Thank you very much. You make quite a big play on the idea of increasing the diversity of the trees in the woodland there. Now, it seems to me it's a piece of woodland in the New Forest, and the New Forest is not that diverse in tree types. Are you going to form an arboretum, or are you just thinking about a few more beech, a few more birch?
My intention is to pick the site, a boggy piece of ground by a stream in a clearing, and then plant an alder there. And then I'll take the boundary and I'll plant a hawthorn and mixed hedge. I'll take the highest, driest spot and I'll plant a sessile oak. So my plan is to not make an arboretum, but to choose the tree to suit the location, to make sure that they don't die in the future. So there are going to be some trees in that 60 species that just aren't suitable. But as we drove through the forest, I didn't see any small leaf lime or wild service tree. The New Forest is quite small in its diversity. And whilst that's very nice, it also could be a problem in the future. If there was climate change, and I know people don't all agree with climate change, but if we hedge our bets, then at least we've saved some small part of the New Forest for the future.
Any other questions? No. Okay. Can I now ask the tree officer, Hannah Chalmers, to present her case?
Okay, thank you, Chair. So I think most of the points I've made as a response to support the TPO has been made in my report, which you should have all seen. I think the overwhelming factor is assessing, obviously the trees have got public amenity, so we walked around the edges of the site today. They're clearly visible from the open forest, and although that isn't a designated public footpath, it's open forest, it is a track shown on an OS map. And whilst we were there today, I mean, I think there was at least 4 or 5 dog walkers or walkers there and a couple of cyclists. So certainly the public and the wider team are getting enjoyment from that backdrop of trees. And then the next assessment really is onto the expediency. And when I read through Mr. Smith's objection, what overwhelmingly came to me was there seemed to be a lack of direction on what he actually wants from this woodland. And that's what caused me most confused. I mean, 1 minute we're talking about timber and timber production, so there seems to be a will to remove trees on the site, and these are mature oak trees. then, I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't potential to potentially thin out some of the larger trees, but that site's pretty thin. There is not a lot more thinning you can do unless you want to produce timber. Then the next phase is, well, it's going to be an education facility, which is all great, and I completely support any kind of getting young children or any people involved in sort of wildlife and nature. But then the next thing that comes, well, what facilities are going to be required on that site? Are we going to be looking at hand washing and toilet blocks? There was already a certificate submitted to the council for a lawful development of a toilet facility on the block, which the council decided it wasn't lawful development. And my concern is that if we want to apply if a planning application came in for a toilet block, I mean, I'm not judging the merits on that, whether that's right. If we want to apply any tree conditions or tree protection measures, a tree has to be TPO'd for it to be effectively protected through planning conditions. So I could be here in 6 months' time when Mr. Smith realises, hang on, I've got children with very particular needs on site. I definitely need facilities for them because of the vulnerabilities and issues that some individual may have. So then we're putting a toilet block in, and then I'll say, well, I'll have to have tree protection measures for that, or then I'm going to be TPOing the trees again. So that's another concern I have. The question of liability, I have not come across in my career of working as a tree officer anyone claiming for liability over the loss of costs of timber. There is definitely an opportunity for a private landowner to claim against the council if we were to make a decision to prevent tree works occurring, that tree subsequently fails, or in relation to a subsidence case, goes on to damage a building, then a landowner can then make a claim cost against the council as long as it's more than £500 for that damage. But loss of value of land or value of timber is not something I've ever come across before. So, I mean, maybe my colleagues in legal might have a clearer view on that. So overall, my view is that I don't think the TPO will obstruct any of the good forestry practice that Mr. Smith wants to carry out. If he gets a felling licence, then that would override the TPO anyway. So having the TPO in place will be clearer to, if there was any subsequent issues or plans to put in any sort of facilities, for using the site as an education facility, and in that way will ensure the argument of reducing it to individuals or groups of trees. I think the problem is you've got to look in the longer term whether that would be enforceable. I mean, Mr. Smith has very helpfully provided us a plan identifying all the trees, but in 10 years, 15 years time, it'll be like, well, was it that oak tree here? Was it that oak tree there? And having it completely clear that the entire site's protected, the council is not allowed to prevent good forestry work under the TPO. So anything that's good forestry management would be granted consent. Anything for health and safety is exempt works. If anything comes like a pest or disease that comes in, the government can issue a blanket, all these trees have to be felled, so it can be done under Secretary of State. So again, that's another thing a TPO would not prevent. So it seems to me that Mr. Smith wants to manage the woodland in a positive way. My concern is that any future development on the site for use of facilities could impact the trees and will have no ability to protect them without a tree preservation being in place on the site.
Thank you, Ms. Chalmers. Mr. Smith, do you have any questions for the tree officer? No? Do any members of the panel have any questions for the tree officer?
As I see it, there is a clear distinction between the value of having a TPO for the whole site and TPO for the individual trees. Could you outline what your concerns are in terms of the management plan that's there, the combination of that with the proposed individual TPOs? What are the significant weaknesses of that strategy? Thank you.
So a TPO doesn't prevent anyone from planting anything on their land as long as it's not planting an invasive species which people shouldn't be planting and are illegal to plant now. So in theory, Mr. Smith could plant whatever he likes. the future could be is I'm going to get, like, I'll use the Christmas tree plantation example, but you plant a plantation of trees, planting them on a commercial basis. You need optimally shaped trees, whether it's for timber production or Christmas tree production. Suddenly that big casting shade of that oak tree that's adjacent is going to cause a problem. The tree will be suppressed on that side. And so then you can see that there's a need then to start clearing some of the mature trees to allow the younger trees to grow up. So any tree planting is welcome as long as it's appropriate for the context of the site and also in balance with what's remaining. If you're interested in ecology and wildlife, the older the tree, the greater the value to wildlife. I think the late Oliver Rackham wrote in his book, a single 1,000-year oak is worth more than 100-year oaks in terms of the diversity. I might be quoting that, but that's the significance. So if you're interested in diversity, the bigger, the older the trees are, the more value you get. Obviously, there is a potential for future climate change and changes, but that would affect the entire forest as well. So we can bring in other trees, but I'm very reluctant at bringing things in from other provinces because of the import of disease factor now. We start bringing in trees from the large tree nurseries that you've got in Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. That's where the Clara ash dieback came from. We really should be looking for UK-grown plants, or certainly plants with plant passports, and try and keep the local provinces as best as possible.
Sorry, can I ask a rider to that, please? I'm still not entirely clear about, is the point you're making that the management plan can be changed without any, so for example, you have a management plan and then subsequently, for whatever reason, that management changes, and what you're saying is that there is no ability to manage as an authority what happens to that management plan, so there is no ability to be able to make sure it fits in with the wider scheme.
So
is that my understanding?
The management plan is something that's submitted to the Forestry England, and that's usually associated with for making an application for a grant. So if you want a small woodland management grant, you have to have a management plan. And part of that might be felling license if it's appropriate to do so, always with a restocking aspect to that. So that's completely administered by the Forestry England. So the district or the council has no dealings with that or enforcing of that management plan, if you like. The tree preservation order would be a factor, and Forestry England would typically consult us on any management plan, certainly any felling license. But at the end of the day, it's more out of politeness on the basis that the felling license overrides. So we can make our comments saying, well, we support or object to this, but if they decide actually we think it's in good forestry management and we're happy with this, then they'll grant the felling license anyway. So we can't enforce any kind of tree planting on private land, and we can't unless we've conditioned it as part of a TPO removal agreement, and we cannot enforce the management plan, but we can grant consent under the TPO to follow that management plan, and then if works then go on beyond the scope of what was agreed in the management plan, then there is the potential that we could enforce under the TPO because the consent was tied into that management plan, and if that has deviated off, then they'll be in breach of the TPO because the decision was based on following that plan. I hope I've made that clear. No, it was a bit confusing, sorry.
Anyone else? Councillor Tripp.
Oh, yes. Now let's get a look at this argument over every seedling being protected on the site. Mr. Smith has suggested that if he allows children on the site and they tread on these little tiny seedlings, that he could be prosecuted. What's your view of that? Is that really a fear, or I mean, tiny seedlings? You wouldn't know whether they were there, would you? Anyway, let's.
So there are several types of tree preservation orders. You've got, I won't go into a dispute, you've got an individual tree, groups of trees, area orders, and woodland orders. So a woodland order is the most onerous form of TPO for a landowner, because effectively anything that could be a tree is protected. So not a seed, but even a small seedling, in theory, is protected by the tree preservation order. However, all local authorities, when it comes to enforcing tree preservation orders and things, you've got to balance out whether it's in the public interest. So would it be in the public interest for a local planning authority to go along to a woodland that's being used as a community resource and start prosecuting nursery groups or cubs groups or the landowner because seedlings have been damaged? I mean, and that relies on the council being a reasonable judge and balance of what's in the public interest or not. But in theory, every tree is protected from the moment it's kind of sprouted out from its seed case.
So in practice, it's not as onerous as it seems in theory. That's what I'm getting from that anyway. Now, you said we shouldn't be able to specify each tree because that'd be too onerous. But we do that, don't we, in smaller orders? So in a way, if you did specify each tree, which is what Mr. Smith would like, that would relieve him of that burden that he fears, the being prosecuted too assiduously. So why are you saying that it'd be impossible to specify each tree and make an order in that form?
No, it wouldn't be impossible to change the order I mean, you could modify this order because you're not making it more onerous by identifying individual trees. The problem with that is the enforceability of that order. Mr. Smith could sell the land, or 20 years' time, a woodland or forestry or tree contractor comes along and goes, well, that tree over there, that oak tree needs some work on, that one over there, which one's protected? Because it's also quite a large area, so zooming in on that scale to be that specific would be quite difficult, and the TPO needs to be the plan needs to be clear and enforceable. The second thing is that, well, what are we protecting? Are we just protecting the big mature trees on site, or are we protecting the land as a whole as the woodland that it currently is? Because as soon as you start going into individuals, then you could turn it, well, let's just turn it into a woodland garden and turf the rest of it, and then it becomes a garden. Well, and then if it becomes a garden, then it's not defined as a woodland under the Forestry Commission rules, and it wouldn't then be subject to a felling license anymore. So it's definitely not, no, you couldn't possibly do that, but I think you've got to look at how enforceable a TPO is and whether you're looking to protect just the big old trees or the principle of the woodland as a whole.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
Any more questions for the tree officer?
I did have some more, if I may. Now, you say that under the TPO, non-native species, would they be protected? I know that laurel and rhododendron would not be protected because we've already established that. But what about something like Leylandi trees? Would they be protected?
Yes, because they are a tree. So anything that's defined as a tree could be protected. So, but not a shrub. So the rhododendron and the cherry laurel are viewed as shrubs. Unfortunately, there's no scientific definition of the difference between a tree and a shrub, but it's largely, it's more of a horticultural difference. Anything really has a typical species with a clear stem is viewed as a tree. So a Leylandi technically would be covered under a woodland TPO, as would, just trying to think of some other thing, a sycamore tree or a exotic catalpa or something. So yeah, some sort of exotic horticultural or ornamental garden tree would be if it was within that woodland boundary.
Okay, but I understand reading the paperwork that he has obtained permission to fell Leylandi trees on the site already. Is that, would you object to that?
The work has carried out. It was quite a long linear group of western red cedar trees, which was at the sort of towards the back of the site, away from the road. They were blocking out a lot of light and shade, and and shaded the site quite densely. They don't provide masses of ecological value, and opening up that area and more life, so they're more natural generation or more planting of native trees and shrubs would be a better benefit. So that Mr. Smith did apply for, and we did give permission. It was outlined in the submitted document by the New Forest Land Advice Service as an advisory to do that as well. So we were in support of what we deemed as reasonable and good management.
Good. As far as you're aware, has Mr. Smith felled any trees during his ownership which would have been protected had a TPO been there, as far as you're aware?
I don't know. I mean, a lot of site clearance has gone on, but it does seem to be, by a long way, mainly cherry, laurel and rhododendron. And that sort of, I mean, the site at the moment looks very bare and stark, and that's likely as a result of having a lot of cherry and rhododendron in there, because that's suppressed any understory. Whether any bigger trees have been felled, I don't know, but the TPO was made. I don't know how long it was in Mrs. ownership before the TPO was made.
Right. Thank you.
Mrs. Smith? You can ask a question, yes, certainly.
Well, just in answer to your question, I'm a solicitor bound by an oath to always be honest, and no trees were felled that would have been protected.
Thank you. Okay. Right. Mr. and Mrs. Burrows, I understand you wish to speak as local residents. You also have the opportunity to ask questions of the objector and the tree officer, so you can do it with either of them. But please keep it to relevant facts. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Toby Burrows from St Christopher. I have got a couple of questions, obviously local residents, so what's important for us is obviously, you know, we're local to the area, so we want to ensure it stays looking nice, and obviously the activities that go on within the woodland. If there was no TPO on the woodland as it was before, to what extent could it be cleared? What protection is there still on the woodland without the TPO? I don't know if that's best for yourself, is it?
So the site, a little bit depends on whether you define the site as a woodland or an extension of someone's garden. So if it's viewed as an extension of someone's garden, then the Forestry Commission's felling licence does not apply. So that's kind of grey area, because it is quite a small woodland, and because it used to be attached to the roughs, the housing was subdivided off, you could almost make that argument. And but the fact that Mr. Smith's going through the Forestry Commission for Small Woodlands grant would make me assume that the Forestry Commission does view that as a woodland. So that would mean the felling licence rules would apply, which you can't fell more than 4 cubic metres of timber in 1 calendar quarter. However, that doesn't stop you felling anything up to that over the next however many years and have that slow erosion take place. So without that TPO, there is nothing enforceable to protect the woodland, unless, of course, some endangered species was discovered on site when the Wildlife Protection Act would come in plus. But for the purposes of trees, unless there's a woodland TPO, there's nothing to stop that slow erosion. I mean, I'm not saying that Mr. Smith's going to do that, but that's the potential.
Yes, just confirm, without the TPO, again, not saying that's your intentions, or if you were to sell the land, that could effectively be cleared then. Someone else could potentially buy it and clear that land.
In theory, they shouldn't be able to fell it overnight, because it would then be in breach of the felling licences if it was asserted that that was a woodland and not a garden. And then you could get into a bit of a legal battle about that if you wanted to go down the technical routes of that.
The other question, we have a little bit of confusion as well about the use of the land. I know you might not apply for the TPO, but obviously I know you've applied for the educational uses. It was mentioned earlier about Christmas trees and felling. I know I've spoken to you. There was a weekend where it was used for camping, for Dungeons and Dragons and something like that. So obviously, again, this is part of our concern with having the TPO potentially removed. Does it affect the land use? I know it was brought up that necessarily it wouldn't affect the land use, but how much protection does the TPO give in that terms?
So now we're straying really into planning law, and the more of a planning officer would be able to give you a better view on this. But the tree preservation order wouldn't prevent Mr. Smith camping in the woodland, having school groups in the woodland, or doing whatever he chose to do on his land, as long as it wasn't willfully damaging the trees. In terms of the use of land and change of use of land, there is, I did look this up because I was wondering whether this question might come up. You can use a site as an educational facility for, I believe, up to 2 academic years without any formal change of use of land, classing of the land under planning laws. But then after that, you may have to require a change of permission of change of use. You may not. It just depends on how the land's being used. So, in theory, and if it became a campsite, that's completely different again, and then that is likely to require planning permission, I believe. So the site's kind of protected from that already by the normal Town Country Planning Act.
I think my concern stems that there doesn't seem to be a direction of where Mr. Smith wants his piece of forest and land to end up. It seems to have had many different directions, that being from growing Christmas trees to being a bush school to felling the wood and selling the timber. We seem to be getting different directions of what he wants to do with it, rather than one consistent plan of, do you want to grow the forest and make it a wonderful forest? Do you want to add species into it and broaden the woodland? It seems that there seems to be something different each 6-month rota when something doesn't pan out. Ultimately, for me, the TPO secures it as being a beautiful woodland location that people walk by and enjoy. We have 3 children and a dog. We walk down there every single day, and it's a beautiful spot, which is why we bought there, why we wanted to live there. It's already changed significantly in the 6-month period that we've lived there. I walk along the front of Blackwell Common, and it's already looking different. Obviously, you haven't cleared the site. You've removed shrubs and trees from the site, and you have stacked it on the site, which is also for me an issue in terms of when the weather is dry, it becomes dry tinder and it's a fire hazard to the site. It doesn't look particularly nice. And my worry is that we're going to start getting into more and more territory where it just becomes a clear site and it doesn't look how it's meant to. And the wildlife factor. I mean, there are woodpeckers, all sorts that we hear, squirrels, various owls. You know, they all enjoy the woodland as it is, and without the TPO being on the site, they all go. And ultimately, we all live in a world that we want to protect, and I just don't feel that that is Mr. Smith's goal, is to protect the forest. I feel like there's just too many different directions of what he wants to do with the site that don't actually make it a forest. And I would like to know a clear picture of what that site intends to be. Is it going to be a felling site? Is it going to be a forest school? Is it going to be used for camping? Is it going to grow Christmas trees? It just seems to have too many different directions, and that's maybe what I want clarity on before we address whether we support or are against the TPO, because if there is no clear outline, I want to protect the forest, and that should be his goal too. And actually, the TPO hasn't prevented him from doing anything he's wanted to do. Everything he's applied for, even with the TPO in place, has actually been granted. And I don't understand why that cannot continue.
Thank you. Like to respond?
I would add, we had refused one application Mr. Smith's made. He applied, I believe he planted some willow saplings for willow coppicing, and Mr. Smith applied for a 100-year permission to coppice them for 100 years. And I felt, as an authority, it was an unreasonable length of time for us to grant consent for something which could potentially change for many reasons, climatic changes, there could be changes in law and all sorts in the future. We wouldn't be adverse to giving a longer term rolling permission, but the limit generally is 10 years. There's nothing set in law how long that limit is, but as an authority, and I think it's good practice, it's certainly 10 years being the maximum.
Yes, certainly may.
I think you touched on it earlier. As part of a TPO, if Mr. Smith came with a plan for what he'd like to do to the forest, can that be granted under the TPO? So rather than just say, right, I want to do this on this tree, if he came up with a forward plan for 6 months, a year, etc., with everything he wants to do, can that be granted under the TPO?
So Mr. Smith has kind of got a plan now. He's submitted a small woodland management plan to the Forestry Commission. Again, if the Forestry Commission are in support of that, we would as an authority be in support of that, because the Forestry Commission is there as the experts to promote good forestry management in England. So yeah, that we wouldn't object. It would be a bit ridiculous as an authority that under the Tam Country we encouraged good practice and good management to then turn around and say, no, you can't do that, when they've got support of the Forestry Commission to do so.
So in that sense, the TPO doesn't give a restriction, does it? Because he's got the plan, you've approved it, he can then get on and do what he needs to do.
Yeah, pretty much. And unfortunately, sometimes the Forestry Commission will issue felling licenses. I'm not saying that this site particular, but they'll do that because of the sites are there for timber and timber production. That's what they've always planted for, even though from a tree preservation order point of view and a tree officer point of view, I think, well, that's really going to affect the amenity of that pocket of area. It's not somewhere we tend to suffer with so much of the district, but sometimes my colleagues in National Park have that dilemma. But obviously, at the end of the day, the felling license trumps the TPO in the legislation anyway, so we can only give our view. So that wouldn't prevent a felling license necessarily being successfully approved for that site.
Right, thank you.
Sorry, can I
Yes, you may.
Can I just ask, so in clarity there, the TPO basically doesn't stop him from planting what he wants to plant now in the future. He can plant and he can develop the forest as he so intends to, but the TPO will protect the forest and maintain it as a forest and make it look as a forest for people to enjoy as they're walking by. So actually there isn't really a gain or a loss for Mr. Smith if the TPO remains in place, because he is saying he wants to develop the forest and plant, and you're saying he can do that with the TPO in place.
In a nutshell, yes, unless there's obviously a conflict between what Mr. Smith wants to do and what we want to do. But if it's got the support of a woodland management plan and a woodland management grant, then obviously we would be in support of that as well.
Thank you. Just to point out to the members of the panel, Mr. and Mrs. Burrows live in the bungalow right opposite Ruff's, I think it is, on the corner. So obviously this is of great concern to them. Do any members of the panel or anyone else have questions for Mr. and Mrs. Burrows? Nope. Okay. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Burrows. Now call on Councillor Mrs. McAvoy. As local member, do you wish to speak?
Yes, I've just got a few words I'd like to say. Thank you, Chairman. I think first I must declare a non-pecuniary interest in as much as I know Mr. Smith. He went to school with my son, and as a county councillor, I have given him a grant to support his aspirations to bring a good outdoor experience to young people. That is the extent of my relationship with Mr. Smith, who is simply one of my constituents. I have always been aware that Mr. Smith was a keen environmentalist, and I have been supportive of what he has been trying to do. However, I was recently notified that a considerable amount of clearing had taken place on his land. So I visited the area with Councillor Alvey a couple of weeks ago, and frankly, I was quite taken aback by the amount of clearance I saw. I became more concerned by Mr. Smith's interpretation of what he believes good tree management is all about. And Mr. Smith can give no guarantees as to what his successors may choose to do with the land, so telling me what the area would look like in 200 years' time wasn't really very much help. At the moment, the area is quite unsightly and out of keeping with the surrounding New Forest vista. And I'm unsure as to what Mr. Smith's actual plan is now for the land, as I've heard numerous ideas having been suggested as to what he intends to do. And that, I think, is the real weakness of the case here. I have read up on the management of invasive rhododendrons. Mr. Smith was quite adamant that these rhododendrons had to come out, which is true. However, the leaflet booklet that I did actually forward to Mr. Smith does talk about the planned management of invasive rhododendrons over several years, with sensitive consideration being given to neighbours and the surrounding vistas. And I don't actually believe this has happened. I did ask Mr. Smith why he hadn't worked more closely with the tree officer, but he has now said that he would do in the future. I hope that he will do. I really do believe that Mr. Smith thinks he's doing the right thing and the best thing, and I do want to support him. But as with often with environmentalists, it's like their way or no way. And I would like the tree officer to work with Mr. Smith to get an outcome that really is fair to everyone.
Thank you, Councillor McAvoy. Do any members of the panel or anyone else have any questions for Councillor McAvoy?
I would just like to reinforce the point that she made about the contact that Mr. Smith had with his neighbours.
Can you couch that in a question?
There's been quite a lot of traffic to and from the site in terms of using it as a school site, an educational site, in terms of minibuses, cars, people walking down to use the site. It becomes very disruptive to neighbours and causes upset. And I wonder if what his intention is of how the site will end up looking for his neighbours and the ones that look at it day in, day out. I'm trying to think of it in a question. I'm sorry, I can't.
Do you agree with that, Councillor McAvoy?
Perhaps I can answer that beautifully put question, in so much as I am actually not aware of any personal approaches to neighbours as to what he's doing to try and get them on side. I have been approached by neighbours about what has been going on. And I have to say, Mr. Smith, I was a little bit disappointed to hear on Sunday that the chainsaws were going, bearing in mind we had this meeting today. I was hoping that we were building bridges to a friendly, supportive way ahead for everybody.
I think you've answered my question, please.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone else have a question of Councillor McAvoy? Okay. And I'll call on Councillor Alexa Carcass, the Parish Council representative. Do you wish to speak?
Only a very minor point about acorns and acorns growing into oaks. Somewhere in the notes here it says you plan to have pigs on site. You will have no problem at all with acorns. That's all.
Does anyone have a question on for Councillor Carcass?
I'm under the impression that he did apply to have livestock on the land, but just to confirm, was it declined? I believe it was refused that he couldn't have livestock on the land. Again, I think this was another direction of the site going to be a site with livestock on, but I believe that was refused by the council.
Thank you. Do any members of the panel have any questions of Councillor Carcass? Right. So can I now invite the tree officer to sum up the case?
I think council, as a council and as a tree officer, I and we support good woodland management, and we do not make tree preservation orders to prevent good management. However, I think in this case of this particular site, where it is quite a small site, where you could argue the exact definition of whether it's a woodland or an extension of a garden, and the potential changes of use through an education facility and what potential changes of facilities on that site would require, I think it is in the interest of the public amenity and expedient to confirm this TPO with this site minor modification of the change of name to reflect the change of name of the site to Blackfield Forest.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, would you like to sum up your case?
I've got nothing further to say. Thank you.
So, before I close the hearing, I'd like to ask everyone if they feel that they've had a fair hearing. Mr. Smith? Ms. Chalmers? Mr. and Mrs. Burrows? Councillor McAvoy? And Councillor Carcass? Thank you. I now declare the hearing closed. The panel will now discuss the matter on the basis of the evidence we have heard. No additional evidence will be sought. The press and public may, if they wish, remain while the decision is made. So we're into discussion.
How are we going to get the range ourselves? We can see one another.
Well, I'll go backwards. Right. Coming in? I'm good.
Right? Yeah.
I'll come back in again then. I've always found with this sort of appeal, that is first of all to get their initial reactions, because we could get over this quite quickly. You can go into discussion and you can end up with hours, but what are your initial feelings? Do you feel, yes, the TPO should be put in?
We've got to have a reasonable determination, haven't we? And my initial, I haven't resolved my initial deliberation between should it be just a TPO on the area, or should it be with a TPO with that management plan?
Yeah.
And I'm kind of veering towards, I think there should be, I think there should be a managed plan as part of that.
I don't think we can put a management plan.
Well, that's what I understood. Could be a. I mean, if it isn't, then that answers that
I'm
question.
not sure. Maybe we can ask for clarification on that point. Is it possible?
Yes, let's ask legal advice on this.
Legal advice?
I understand that if the TPO is in place, the management plan doesn't run in tandem with it.
It's not mandatory.
Well, yes, and the fact is that the owner has to still work with the tree officer for any plans regarding that. That's
Right. Okay, then. Well, that certainly answers that one.
I think there's a problem with the microphones. I think we've got too many on at once. And I hesitate. Can we just take it one at a time? Because otherwise,
I'll leave this one on then.
we can only have, I think, two on at once.
Okay.
The other concern I have is about how much we can determine how someone uses their own land for their, for their own enjoyment, for their own, So it's really how much bearing how much weight we should give the land use if it's not actually impacting on the trees that are those that need to be preserved, and that I think is an area of worry there.
Just on that, I think that does a TPO actually prevent Mr. Smith from doing what he wants to do?
Yeah.
I'm not sure it does, but anyway, Councillor Tip.
No, I don't think it does really. It looks as though he can do what he wants to do, provided that it's reasonable. So I would suggest that we would apply the TPO. It seems a reasonable thing to do. And from what I've heard today, Mr. Smith can still manage his land and still harvest his timber and have children on the site and do all the things that he would like to do. He can do multiple things. He doesn't have to have only one thing. He can do several things to it.
Thank you. Councillor Carpenter or Councillor Turnbull?
Yeah, I think that this piece of land, I think the woodland vista has been spoilt. Just standing, looking from the forest, from the side of it, from Chapel Left, from the cemetery. Obviously the vista of the woodland, which is what we're talking about, is very different. And I think it would be, using the word as we were asked to use, I think it'd be very much expedient to put the put the TPO in place or keep it there. I would like to say actually that there are positives. Having said that, I think the gentleman has said some really positive things about adding new tree varieties and managing it as this education area. So I hope he doesn't go away and think that we're not interested in what he's doing or keen that he does that. But I really think there is a place, especially for the future as well, after this gentleman owns the land. Yeah.
Councillor Tango.
Thank you, Chairman. This piece of land does have high amenity values, no doubt about that. It's part of a long row of woodland which is hiding the urban development away from the common there. So it's really crucial that it remains. I mean, if it disappeared, you'd have a hole, and it would be horrendous. So the amenity value is proven in my opinion. A TPO is not going to hinder Mr. Smith in anything he wants to do. We've heard that he can apply for a felling licence if he wants to, or if he needs to take wood out. He can bring in new species as required. He can have his education facility. I know someone who might be interested, in fact, in using it. So it wouldn't be a hindrance. I would say to Councillor Carpenter that woodland management does actually create what appears to be an awful mess when it's underway, and it will recover. We've had that in local woodlands where I am. So yes, people say, what are you doing? But in fact, it recovers over a couple of years and then settles down and looks good. So yes, it looks very messy at the moment, but I wouldn't let that change my opinion. But I think the TPO really has to be confirmed because it won't stop him doing anything.
Yes, I feel the same. I feel that a TPO won't really affect your what you can do in your piece of wood, which is a lovely spot, and I applaud what you're trying to achieve, and I'd like to see more of it because looking after our forest is so important. So I would vote for the TPO to be put on. So we've got 4 people. Are you on for putting the TPO on?
Yes, I think so. I mean, obviously, I obviously misunderstood what was said earlier about some management plan. So yeah. I don't see any reason to go against the TPO based on what I've heard.
The same here. Okay, so we have 5. We're all in agreement. Yeah. So that would be our decision. I'll hand over to the legal guys now to
thank you, Chair.
What they want to read out.
Well, no, I just wanted to raise the point that the plan will require modification because if it is correct that there is any misinterpretation of as it is on the ground, I'm not sure if that is because I would probably have to get the input from our tree officer, but. As the decision is made, perhaps we can actually touch upon that point.
We can reduce the size of the plan,
yeah.
We cannot increase
yes.
the size of the plan. So there's an element that needs to be drawn back, and we can do that. Modify it. If the additional bit of land that Mr. Smith highlighted that he thinks should be protected, then that would have to be a separate order.
Yes. Okay. What I very much recommend is that Mr. Smith works with the tree officer for the future and to make your piece of land a very desirable spot, which I think it is. I think it can be improved, and I wish you all the best with it. So,
Chairman, can we just confirm that the TPO is confirmed according to the panel's wishes, and as a consequence of that, did the panel also confirm that a minor modification be made to amend the title to reflect the change of name of the site to the land of Blackwell Forest, Chapel Lane, Langley?
That sounds to me absolutely spot on, so thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman. So that's the end of the hearing. Thank you very much.
So everyone. Thank you all for coming. Do I bang my gavel?